It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. As I discussed in an earlier episode, 1998's Blade turned out to be a kind of important little horror comic book movie. In the latter half of the 90s, comic book movies were not really doing so well. 1989's Batman and 1992's Batman Returns were big hits. 1995's Batman Forever was truly a big hit and also sold a ton of soundtracks, to the point that I think that movie is the origin point of film soundtracks no longer featuring music directly heard in the movie. For some years after that movie, soundtracks tended to be labeled as songs inspired by instead of music from whatever the movie title would be after that. But Batman Forever was also a departure from the previous two Batman films in terms of actor, feel, and look. And this was due to Joel Schumacher taking over the reins as director. And the follow-up, Batman and Robin in 1997, would go on to be known as one of the worst when it came to comic book movies for overly silly dialogue, pretty bad acting, and a strange pseudo ad placement. It really, all it turned out to be was just one big giant commercial to sell Batman toys. And along with that, other movies like Steel, starring Shaquille O'Neal, Spawn, and a failure to bring Superman back to the big screen meant that the superhero craze might have already been over by the time 1998's Blade came along. And all this was going on as Marvel was trying to get into the game. But Blade, an unabashedly R-rated movie full of vampires, cussing, blood, buckets and buckets of blood, turned out to be a great proof of concept that Marvel could potentially sell their major characters if their B, C, and D-list characters could succeed with mainstream audiences. And I still say that without Blade, Marvel wouldn't have put as much behind 2000's X-Men, and without X-Men being as popular and as well received as it was by audiences, you wouldn't have had Spider-Man, which basically led all the way to 2008's Iron Man and the current Marvel Cinematic Universe. But New Line Cinema and Marvel Enterprises immediately planned for a Blade sequel. And that's what we're going to be talking about on this week's Monster Mondays, 2002's Blade 2. Writer David S. Goyer originally wanted to use another vampire character from the Marvel roster, Morbius. Marvel denied Goyer's request in the hopes to use Morbius for a franchise of its own. So, bad decisions concerning the plausibility of the Morbius character being the lead of his own movie goes back a very long time with Avi Arad over at Marvel Enterprises. But anyway, also originally, director Stephen Norrington was asked to return to make Blade 2. However, he turned down the offer. This opened the door for a favorite of these parts to step into the director's chair, Guillermo del Toro. Yeah, I figured it was with Del Toro's recent release of his version of Frankenstein, just getting released somewhat recently, why not go ahead and slide Blade 2 onto the schedule before the end of 2025? Now, Goyer was a fan of Del Toro's, and Del Toro was kind of coming off the nightmare production of Mimic, and his war with Harvey Weinstein over that movie. And Del Toro wanted to continue getting opportunities in America, and Blade 2 would be the one that actually broke him through to later go on to make two very well-received and successful Hellboy movies, which in turn would lead to Del Toro getting several notable mainstream releases made by Hollywood studios. And again, the Blade franchise delivers on things that are big deals more than 2 decades later. Now, it didn't hurt that Del Toro was a comic book and horror fan, and he was tired of the kind of tortured Victorian romantic vampire. He wanted them to be truly scary again. And he also wanted the movie to have a comic book and anime feel to it. And he dove into the role of director by first studying pretty much every frame of the first Blade movie. He wanted to know the dialogue, the filmmaking language, and the flow of the first film as if he made it. And he was very complimentary of Norrington's style and how he directed that first film. And what's more, Del Toro was very excited to work with Wesley Snipes. Snipes loved being Blade and was very excited to get another go with the character. And Del Toro knew that no one in front or behind the camera would know the character as well as Wesley Snipes. And he could really use the actor to understand before shooting a scene what Blade would or would not do in any given scenario in the plot, or how he would portray that character on camera. So, having somebody who's that intertwined with that, with a character like that, is a godsend for a director that's kind of stepping in, who is making a sequel that is who didn't make the first one. But upon release, about 5 weeks ahead of the first Spider-Man, Blade 2 would end up making over $150 million, nearly tripling its budget. Roger Ebert loved the movie, giving it 3.5 stars out of 4. His quote is something like, quote, a rather brilliant vomitorium of viscera, unquote. And the movie guaranteed a third would be made relatively quickly. And sure enough, in 2004, Blade Trinity released to much less excitement. But we're not here to talk about Blade Trinity. We're here to talk about Guillermo del Toro's Blade 2. Now, the sequel begins in Prague, and I think I do need to back up here real quick to the original Blade movie. In the first movie, Blade's buddy, Abraham Whistler, who was played by Chris Christopherson, he's the guy who made all of Blade's weapons, and he helped him deal with the bloodthirst that he had and all of that. He was attacked and bitten by the villain of that first movie, Deacon Frost, and his gang of vampires. And the last that we saw Whistler was when Blade basically was kind of talking to him, and Whistler was like, you gotta kill me, basically. He didn't want to come back as a vampire. Blade refused to, so what Whistler did was he asked for Blade to give him a gun so that he could kill himself before he would become a vampire. So, and so that's what Blade did. And there is even indication that he went through with that. Now, that was basically the last we saw of him. So Blade, we find out in this, is looking for Whistler because it seems as though Whistler was not able to kill himself before turning into a vampire. So he is most definitely a vampire, and he's being held in Prague, basically in a tank full of blood to basically keep him alive and to basically torture him over, what information they can give about Blade and his whereabouts and what he's up to and all that stuff. But Blade ultimately tracks Whistler down, and he takes Whistler to his current hangout, where his new young weapons builder named Scud, who's played by Norman Reedus, is holed up with Blade's various tools of the trade. And Blade ultimately leaves Whistler in a room to attempt to cure him. And as Blade says, if it doesn't really work, the morning sun will put him out of his misery. But it turns out that the cure works, and Blade and his father figure, Whistler, are reunited. And that really is kind of more like a coda to the first movie, because as we get into our main plot, which is also taking place in Prague, there is a blood bank that's run by vampires. And this guy shows up, and you think, oh, this guy's selling his blood because he's tweaking on drugs or something like that. There's something obviously wrong with this guy. But he has a very distinct scar that runs down his chin and his neck to his collarbone. And once he gets taken back by the technicians, he ends up attacking them and saying that he hates vampires. And that scar on his chin ends up splitting, and it becomes like a set of mandibles. And he also has something like kind of like a bunch of tentacles that ends up creating like a protrusion that is basically what latches on to people to feed from them. Now, this is due to some sort of an infection that is turning people and vampires into what's being called reapers. And yeah, both vampires and people can be turned into these things, and the bites are extremely infectious, and it does not take very long to turn a vampire or a human into a Reaper once infected. Now, the original carrier of this infection, Jared Nomak, is the one who attacked the blood bank and harbors the intense hatred of vampires. Now, knowing that this guy is a legitimate threat to vampires and humans alike, the ruler of the vampire nation, Eli Damascanos, sends his daughter Nisa and his trusted servant Assad to offer a truce to Blade. And as bad as Blade is, Reapers are even worse. Their ravenous need to feed will infect others quickly. So once Jared Nomak and his infected attack and infect the vampire population, it only stands to reason that they will then turn to feed on humans. Nisa introduces the Blood Pact to Blade. And the Blood Pact was essentially created by her father to kind of basically hunt and kill Blade, but now they all have to work together, and it's an uneasy alliance here. Now, but Blade and the Blood Pack arrive at a nightclub run and frequented by vampires, and he assumes that this would be a good place to start, as the Reapers would likely be going to places where vampires are basically gathering in large groups. And he's right. The Reapers arrive at the nightclub, and Jared Nomak is quite keen on the fact that the fabled Daywalker is there too. And when the Reapers attack, they prove to have nigh invulnerability. Blade's weapons have no effect on them. The Blood Pack's weapons have no effect on them either. And seemingly the only thing that these Reapers have a weakness to is sunlight. So as Blade and Novak fight, a couple members of the Blood Pack are bitten by the various other Reapers that Novak has turned, but dawn arrives and the Reapers have to retreat. And in the aftermath, Blade smells something fishy. Why didn't Nissa tell him Reapers are immune to silver and garlic? Also, why didn't Jared Nomak kill her when he had her dead to rights? And unbeknownst to Blade, Damascanos is also willing to wager the life of his own daughter for whatever this Reaper business is. He's almost like not telling her that she and her Blood Pack and Blade are all being used as pawns or almost like they're bait to the Reapers. Now, when the sun is out, Blade takes the team into the underground to hunt the Reapers. Now, one of the Blood Pack has been slowly changing into a Reaper, so that's an internal problem that they have. And they've also set up traps to ambush the vampires, the Reapers have. So a couple of the vampires also decide to spend more time getting revenge on Blade by beating up Whistler for him not being at his post in the earlier stakeout at the vampire nightclub that led to one of their number being killed. And this leads to the already multiplying numbers of Reapers to get the upper hand and overrun the team, killing most of them until Blade can set off a massive UV light bomb that basically kills all of the Reapers except for Novak. The bomb also gravely injures Nissa, but Blade saves her life by allowing her to drink his blood, which gives her this sense that Blade really isn't the boogeyman that the vampires think he is. He is noble. He has a certain sense of righteousness that she kind of appreciates and sees some good in. But Novak encounters Whistler during this whole escape and tells him that he'll live so that he can deliver a message to Blade, which concerns how he was created by his own father, Eli Damascanos. Meanwhile, Damascanos has sent people to capture Blade, Whistler, and Scud. And yeah, Damascanos was trying to create a pure-blooded vampire race that would be immune to all the stuff vampires are weak to. In addition to that, Scud has been feeding information to Damascanos because he is one of the vampire overlord's familiars. And so, obviously, Damascanos' whole thing is not really working out well because it mutated Jared Novak. So he wants to take Blade into a surgical room and have his people basically harvest his blood, bone marrow, and organs to help unlock the secrets of his unique daywalker biology to help Damasceno's experiments to genetically alter all vampires so that they don't have they basically would all become Blade. They would have none of the weaknesses of vampires, but all of their strengths. And it seems as though Damasceno wants to hold on to the bloodlust because he ultimately wants vampires to be able to walk among the day so that they can rule over Earth. However, Jared Nomak gets into the Damasceno base and to get his revenge on his father while Whistler gets free from the number one blood pack goon, Reinhardt, who's played by the always great Ron Perlman. Whistler then frees Blade, and Blade goes for a bath in a big pool of blood that Damasceno has in his lair. This superpowers Blade, and he starts messing up a bunch of guards and goons until he finally gets the chance to fight Reinhardt after a whole movie of those two antagonizing each other. And ultimately, he ends up pretty easily dispatching Reinhardt, despite Reinhardt's big talk about how he plans to basically kill Blade like he's nothing. But meanwhile, Novak kills Damasceno, but does not kill Nyssa at her own request. Instead, he infects her with the Reaper virus. Blade arrives to battle Nomak, and after a long fight between the two, Blade manages to stab Nomak in the only place that the creature's heart could be penetrated. Now, when you turn into a Reaper, there's like a bone structure that forms around the Reaper's heart, meaning that would have been something that would have been beneficial to vampires because that means that they couldn't have their hearts staked. But it's a problem for the Reapers because it takes away one way that you could potentially kill them. But there was a way that if you could stab under the arm through the side of the chest, you could get to the heart. Now, realizing that he is going to die, Jared Nomak basically pushes the Blade further into his heart, killing himself. Now, realizing that she's going to be turned into a Reaper soon, Nyssa asks Blade to take her outside to see the sun so that she can die as a vampire. And after she disintegrates, Blade and Whistler get back to work, and they go to London to track down and kill more vampires. Alright, so let's talk about 3 things I like about Blade 2. First, I really like the action scenes in this movie. Sure, over 20 years on, these scenes heavily rely on the burgeoning CGI effects ability, but the speed of the fights, especially early on when Blade is taking on vampires, and also there's the scene at the end of the movie when he's fighting through all of the guards and goons so he can get to Reinhardt. They're really exciting scenes. I mean, I especially like the scene in which Assad and Nyssa sneak into Blade's base like ninjas. The fight turns out to be lightning fast. It's Blade being the best fighter that we know him to be, but also shows that these other two might just be as good as Blade. And before that, the opening action scene for Blade was against some guys on motorcycles. So, all of these action scenes really highlight the comic book origins of this character. And Guillermo del Toro also said he wanted that kind of anime feel to it, and you can definitely feel that as well. So he did a really good job of capturing that comic feel, that kind of cartoony comic booky feel. So much so, in fact, that it really does play out kind of like a comic book would read as well. All this movie takes place in what really amounts to just a couple of days, because if it was any more than that, the world would have been screwed pretty badly by the Reaper virus. So not only does the action play like comic book panels, but the plot itself reads like a comic book plot. And that's David Goyer knowing his comic book stuff as well. So it's obvious that Del Toro and Goyer really knew how to work with that kind of pacing and with that kind of style. Second, Wesley Snipes is very good in this. As clear as it is that Del Toro knows how to operate within the realm of comic book plots and action as a director, it's also clear that Snipes lives and breathes the Blade character. It's no wonder why he kept wanting to make these movies and returned for Deadpool and Wolverine. After just over one full movie, you already cannot disassociate the character Blade from the image of Snipes playing the character. I mean, he's a badass, but he's also a really good guy. He only gets along with this team up because it would be a net positive for humanity, not really to assist the vampires. And despite still having this hard-edged, badass demeanor, you really like Snipes as Blade. And he does have a few times where he is playful in the part too, when he's messing around with Ron Perlman, or in some of the lines that he has. There is a little bit of playfulness in there too. But at the end of the day, you really trust him. I mean, he's your guy to deal with these nasties that go bump in the night. And I've always liked Wesley Snipes, but it's really hard to not think of him as Blade and to not like him and even love him as Blade. Third, I really like the Reapers. Okay, so it was stated earlier that one of the goals that Guillermo del Toro had was to make vampires scary again. He didn't want that kind of romantic stuff or the tortured soul of the upper class, kind of Victorian style of vampire. He was definitely keeping with something sort of established in the first movie, thanks to how Goyer really kind of took that direction with trying something different while still keeping the idea of a vampire society and a hierarchy. And sure, Damascus is kind of the classic vampire who dwells in something that would look sort of like like a castle, albeit modernized on the inside or on the outside, but the inside looks all stony and gothic and stuff. And he definitely looks gross, like a Nosferatu. But if my main man Del Toro wanted to make vampires scarier, this is definitely achieved through the Reapers. I mean, they are twisted vampires. They are sort of vampires, but also kind of feral or almost zombie-like. They have this constant hunger, which means that they're always on the attack. They crawl around the walls. They ambush food and all of that stuff. And, they are legitimately scary. Then with the whole mandible thing, with the more Lovecraftian feeding that acts, a little like the little mouth in the Alien movies, Xenomorphs. So there's that going for them too. They're gross to look at. And they are more creepy because their eyes go pale, when infected, and that wall crawling and the constant hiding in the shadows and the constant on the attack mode. They are really cool monsters. And Reapers also give Blade something other than just another bunch of vampires to fight like he did in the first movie. So there is a slightly different flavor for the sequel. So, and I also want to give big ups to Luke Goss, who plays Jared Nomak, for being a truly creepy and scary monster for our hero to fight against. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at FilmSeizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast and the Monday afternoon Monster Mondays podcast at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload this stuff to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. And next time, it's another sequel, and it's time to follow up on Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2 with the comedy horror final entry of the Evil Dead trilogy, 1992's Army of Darkness. And until next week, stay spooky.